Good morning, economics, and welcome to Unit 3, Lesson 7, Regulating Market Power. Concerns over market power are nothing new. In the early 1900s, newspaper and magazine writers known as muckrakers published stories about the abusive practices of large firms in the transportation, energy, and steel industries, among others. Ida Tarbell, pictured here writing at her desk, wrote a series of articles that was turned into a book called History of the Standard Oil Company, which exposed John D. Rockefeller, the owner of the Standard Oil Company and president, exposed his drive to create an oil monopoly. Eventually, the muckrakers' revelations caused public outrage, particularly because the high cost of rail transport increased the cost of many other goods. The result was the adoption of government regulations meant to make society better off by promoting competition among firms. In this lesson, we'll recap the efficiency of each market structure and discuss old and new ways of dealing with problems created by market power. Our key idea for this lesson is that antitrust regulations are designed to limit the inefficiencies brought about by imperfectly competitive markets. And our learning objectives. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to analyze the effects of market structure on efficiency. You should be able to discuss the pros and cons of price controls. And you should be able to explain the purpose of antitrust policy and how it is enforced. So let's take a look at market structure and efficiency. In Lesson 5, we saw that it is best for society if production increases until the cost of making another unit would exceed the highest price consumers would pay for it. When the price equals marginal cost, consumers can purchase every unit that is worth at least as much to them as the cost of making it. When the price exceeds the marginal cost, the quantity of output is inefficiently small. Additional units of the good are worth more to consumers than the cost of making them, and yet they are not made. Whenever competition is imperfect, as in a monopoly, an oligopoly, or a monopolistically competitive market, this sort of inefficiency arises. Perfect competition results in the efficient level of production. This results from a condition for efficiency hidden within our model of supply and demand. The supply curve indicates the marginal cost of production, and as you know, the equilibrium price is determined by the intersection of the supply and demand curves. Since the price comes from a point along the supply curve at the intersection with demand, and the supply curve tells us the marginal cost, we know that the price equals the marginal cost in a perfectly competitive market. The resulting efficiency explains why economists are fond of competition. Monopoly, on the other hand, represents an extreme form of imperfect competition. A monopolist selects the output level that equates marginal revenue and marginal cost, and chooses its price by going up from the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost to the demand curve. The price therefore exceeds the marginal cost, and the monopoly produces an inefficiently small quantity of output. If a monopolist can employ perfect price discrimination, charging each customer his or her reservation price, then the inefficiency of monopoly is eliminated. Price discrimination can be difficult to implement, however, because it is hard to estimate customers' reservation prices. Remember also that the gains from perfect price discrimination go entirely to firms, not to consumers. The consumers are charged a price that equals their benefit from the good, so they are indifferent between buying the good or not. So let's see if you can summarize that. Why is perfect competition more efficient than monopoly? And remember, in terms of our definition of efficiency here, an efficient market remember, is a market in which demand, right, equals supply. And we reach that in a perfectly competitive market because the cost of producing it is the same as what the consumer is willing to pay for it. And that is efficient. Therefore, everyone gets what they want. All right, let's continue. Efficiency in monopolistic competition and oligopoly. An oligopoly is always one collusive step away from being a monopoly. Remember, that collusion is where they all act together and they form essentially a monopoly where they are, because they're acting together, right? That would be a monopoly. They're not quite there yet, but they're always one step away from getting there. So firms in an oligopoly have a joint incentive to act like a monopolist and set the price above the marginal cost. But they have individual incentives to compete with each other by undercutting one another's prices. An oligopoly is unlikely to be as inefficient as a monopoly, but it is also unlikely to be as efficient as perfect competition. Finally, monopolistic competition results in some inefficiency because each supplier has market power due to brand loyalty and therefore can set its price above the marginal cost. Yet, monopolistic competition yields some benefits for consumers as well. Firms have an incentive to invest in product development and product differentiation, which results in greater product variety for customers or consumers. Monopolistic competition thus has some benefits for consumers compared with the case of a pure monopoly. Another did you get it? Let's see if we can summarize this. Are oligopoly and monopolistic competition likely to be as inefficient as monopoly? Why or why not? All right, let us continue. And we will now look at regulations. Direct regulations. Price controls are limits established by the government on prices for a product or service in a particular industry. Price controls are not common today, but during the course of U.S. history, many natural monopolies were subject to price controls. Examples have included cable TV, airlines, and trucking. Price controls still exist, for instance, in the markets for public utilities, including water and electricity. The goal in setting price controls is to bring about the efficient quantity of the good. As you have learned, this means setting the price equal to the marginal cost. There is an interesting exception in the case of natural monopolies. The marginal cost is below the average cost for a natural monopoly. So a price equal to the marginal cost will result in losses for the firm. Instead, the price can be set equal to the average cost, which is as low as the price can go without eventually putting the firm out of business. Price controls have lost favor among many economists and policymakers due to the difficulty of pinpointing the price that will achieve efficiency. It is difficult for the government to accurately assess firms' marginal cost and consumers' willingness to pay. And if the factors that determine cost should change, the marginal cost becomes a moving target. Consumer preferences also change over time, which causes the efficient quantity to change. Monitoring these changes in market conditions is difficult, if not impossible, so price regulation introduces its own set of problems. This does not necessarily mean the regulation is undesirable, but it does mean that the benefits should be weighed against the costs. Another, did you get it? What are price controls? And you have the definition right in the previous slide. Let us continue. Antitrust policy. A large body of law has evolved to prevent firms from unfairly acquiring or using market power. Together, this set of laws forms our government's antitrust policy. A trust is a combination of corporations formed for the purpose of reducing competition and controlling prices in an industry. Antitrust policy places regulations on business practices to encourage competition. Even in a market economy, laws are important to ensure adequate rivalry on a level playing field. As an early landmark of antitrust policy, the U.S. Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 to eliminate restraints on trade and competition. This was followed by the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which strengthened and clarified the Sherman Act. The Sherman and Clayton Acts apply to firms that do business in more than one state. Most states have comparable laws that apply to firms that operate only in one state. Antitrust laws promote competition by making it illegal for firms to engage in a conspiracy to fix prices at an agreed-upon level. They also block firms from merging together if the merger is likely to reduce competition and harm consumers. And they prohibit predatory acts that achieve or maintain market power, such as temporarily cutting prices to drive competitors out of business. Bear in mind that the mere existence of a monopoly is not illegal. It is illegal, however, to gain or exploit a monopoly position by improper conduct. For example, the Clayton Act prevents a practice known as tying, in which a customer who wants to buy a product from a firm is required to buy other products from the same firm. The maker of your school's copy machine, for instance, can't require the school to buy its paper and ink as well. The Clayton Act also prohibits firms from having interlocking directorates, meaning that one person serves on the corporate boards of two competing firms at the same time, which could reduce the competition between those firms. The Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission have websites where you can explore, if you're interested in this, more about what they do and the history of antitrust policy in the United States. All right, so did you get it? What is antitrust policy? All right, let's continue. Antitrust laws are enforced primarily by two agencies of the federal government, the two I just mentioned, the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. These two agencies can investigate practices that restrict competition, and they can bring a lawsuit against a firm that they believe has violated the law in an effort to exert monopoly power. The Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission keep a watchful eye on potential mergers of firms and proposed acquisitions of one firm by another. If two firms in an industry were to merge, for example, the office supply giants OfficeMax and Staples, the combined firm would have greater market power, which might hurt consumers and other competitors. With the advice of many economists, the government has developed a set of guidelines to assist decisions about whether a merger should be challenged. If an antitrust agency's experts believe that the merger of two firms will raise the product price by 5% or more, the agency will generally challenge the proposed move in court. A judge then decides whether the merger would indeed harm consumers. A number of other federal and state regulatory agencies also have jurisdiction over aspects of anti-competitive practices in specific industries. For example, the Securities and Exchange Commission monitors the financial industry, and the Federal Communications Commission regulates the broadcast TV and radio industries. It is important for the managers of a firm to know who their regulators are and to avoid participation in any improper anti-competitive practices. All right, so did you get it? Which two agencies are primarily responsible for enforcing antitrust laws? Take a moment to answer. All right, and we're back. To help illustrate this point, particularly about antitrust, I want to return to the potential merger of OfficeMax and Staples. And we can see how this was viewed by the agencies that monitor this. On September 4, 1996, Staples and Office Depot announced that they planned to merge. At the time, each office supply chain had approximately 500 stores, and their combined annual sales were more than $10 billion. In April of 1997, the Federal Trade Commission voted to oppose the transaction and filed a lawsuit to block the merger. In its complaint, the FTC defined the product market as consisting of consumable office supplies sold through office supply superstores. The Commission identified 42 geographic markets in which it predicted a lack of competition that would mean consumers would see price increases. Our bar graph below reproduces a key piece of evidence that the FTC presented to the court. The graph shows an index of average office supply prices at Staples depending on the amount of competition it faced in a geographic area. In some areas, such as St. Louis, Staples had competition from Office Depot and OfficeMax, while in others it faced less intense competition. In markets where Staples had no other superstores to compete with, shown in green, prices were substantially higher than in markets where Staples and Office Depot both had stores. The FTC won an injunction against the merger in U.S. District Court in June of '97. Subsequently, Staples and Office Depot abandoned the proposed merger. All right, and I do have a "Did you get it?" question for this last little example. So why do you think prices were lowest in markets where Staples had two competitors? Or I should say, at least two competitors. All right, when you're done with that, that is the end of our lesson for today, the end of Unit 3, Lesson 7. Go ahead and work on the concept check, and we will talk about this lesson next time. See you later.